BrexitCentral, Jonathan Isaby, and writer and researcher Maya Goodfellow joined me now. Welcome both. Maya, if I could firstly start with you. This is the first time that a new Prime Minister will take the reins halfway through a minority government. How important is that fact?
Yeah, I think it is incredibly important, but I think it's also important that it looks like Boris Johnson is going to be the person who wins this contest. And already we're seeing people resign, we're seeing people say they're going to resign from the cabinet. And that is not a good sign in terms of not only just getting Brexit through, but also what that means for the country at a time of real division, at a time of real urgency where we need some kind of show from government that they have a plan about what we're going to do next and that they're united behind it. I actually don't think it would be possible with the Conservative government to get that, to really get that kind of unity that's needed, to really get a plan in terms of what needs to happen with Brexit. The Conservative Party is in such disarray, it's so deeply divided. We've seen that over the past 3 years. We've seen essentially Theresa May consistently put party unity ahead of the country. It doesn't look like that's really going to change at all with Boris Johnson, a man who we've seen consistently put his own career ahead of everything else. So I think actually it's incredibly worrying that he is primed to become Prime Minister within the next few weeks.
OK. Jonathan, we've seen the resignation of Sir Alan earlier today. We had resignation of Margot James last week. We're expecting the Chancellor Philip Hammond will resign by Wednesday. The divisions continues, not looking good for the future of the Tory party, is it?
I mean, I think the behaviour of someone like Sir Alan Duncan today is incredibly self-indulgent. You know, the fact is that whenever there is a new government that takes hold, everything is up for appointment or reappointment. And I think he resigned today in order that he could get his exchange of letters with Theresa May, which happened in the last hour or so. He was never going to be appointed by Boris Johnson to any position, assuming that Boris Johnson wins it. And frankly, at a moment when there's a bit of a crisis going on in the Middle East, the Foreign Office Minister resigning self-indulgently like that, I think sends a pretty bad message, and it is not very helpful. Yeah,
but Jonathan, I guess what Sir Alan would say is that he is thinking about the interests of the country, for one, and Boris Johnson, a man who he served as the number 2 for when Boris Johnson was a Foreign Secretary. He believes that Boris Johnson shouldn't be the person leading the country, and this is his political statement, his political way of doing so.
Well, you're right, it's a political statement, it's certainly that. I certainly don't think it's in the interests of the country to resign from the Foreign Office on a whim at this moment when, clearly, in the next couple of days, a new government would be assembled, and he will not be part of that. But to not spend those last couple of days of the May government in office, I think is pretty petty on his part.
Maya, the Conservative Party have a working majority of 3. We are expecting cabinet appointments to be made over the next couple of days. Inevitably, there will be some people who will be disappointed with the fact that they haven't been given a cabinet post or a senior government post. That will pose questions for Boris Johnson if he does become the next leader of the Conservative Party and the next Prime Minister.
Yeah, I think we'll have to wait and see what Boris Johnson's cabinet will look like and then judge on the appointments that he makes. But actually what I found most astonishing throughout this leadership contest is anyone talking about Boris Johnson as the one nation candidate. This is a person who not only has talked about no deal as if it's a sensible thing that may happen, but who has also called Muslim women wearing the hijab, comparing them to letterboxes, who has said of the African continent, the problem was not that we were in charge, it's that we're no longer in charge, but who's also been part of an administration. I think this is incredibly important. In part of a government that has overseen real-term spending cuts 8% to school budgets, has meant that an average class of children that is the size of 30, 9 of those children would actually be in poverty, has overseen rising levels of homelessness, and has meant that our public services have been absolutely decimated. So this does matter because it's not just about Brexit. Brexit is incredibly important, but we have a country that is on the brink of collapse when it comes to our public services. And someone like Boris Johnson has been absolutely fine with that happening.
Sure. But I guess what Boris Johnson and his supporters would be saying is that all of those issues that you've just highlighted can only be dealt with once Brexit has been put to bed, once we get over the line and it's done and dusted. And at least for the Conservative leadership and the Conservative membership, they believe that Boris Johnson is the man to get us through this impasse.
Yeah, it's not that Brexit doesn't matter. Of course, it's incredibly important, and any government would have to deal with Brexit in order to deal with other domestic issues. But I suppose the point more is that the Conservatives have been in government in some form or another for the past 9 years. They have entrenched inequality, they have worsened poverty, they have meant that children are going to bed hungry up and down the country. And these people who are standing in front of us saying that they want to lead the country, someone like Boris Johnson has almost no solutions to these problems. So yes, Boris Johnson is in what he does in Brexit is incredibly important. But the issue is that actually a Boris Johnson-led government is not going to have the solutions to these huge problems facing the country because they have helped create them in the first place.
Jonathan?
Boris Johnson is a very thoughtful politician, and I'm sure that he will, again, assuming he wins, which I think we agree he will assemble a cabinet and advisers around him who will be looking at the whole gamut of issues facing the country. And I absolutely accept that there are some very big issues facing the country, whether it be social care, housing, special educational needs funding. All those are important issues, and frankly, they haven't had the attention they've required over the last several years because of Brexit. I think Whitehall, the bandwidth taken up by Whitehall on Brexit has been immense, which is all the more reason that Brexit needs to happen as soon as possible. And Boris Johnson has said it will happen on October the 31st on his watch. It's essential that does happen because then the country can focus on a whole load of other issues which clearly do need attention. But one thing Boris Johnson does need to do is to make sure that any government he puts together does believe in Brexit. And in that sense, losing people like Philip Hammond and Alan Duncan is not necessarily going to be the end of the world, because those are people who did not believe in Brexit, who saw Brexit as a problem to be managed rather than to champion the result of that referendum we had back in 2016. I did some research last week of the members of Parliament currently in the government, more than 90 of them, only a quarter actually voted for Brexit back in 2016. This government under Theresa May has had a real look of a Remainer government trying to deliver Brexit, and as a result it failed absolutely everybody on the Brexit front. So I think it's really important that Boris Johnson assembles an administration in terms of cabinet ministers, junior ministers and advisers around him who do believe in this great project on which we're embarking.
Maya, I saw you shaking your head.
Well, I think this idea that you need people who believe in Brexit, I don't really find that so convincing what that actually means. What we actually saw from Theresa May when she was Prime Minister was her consistently pandering to the hard right of the Conservative Party, the ERG, and consistently drawing these ridiculous red lines that were very difficult to deliver on. And this is the point with Brexit, is there is a political reality where you are negotiating with the EU, and you do have to take into account what it means to negotiate with other people and not just make demands that are not possible to deliver on, and also recognise the issue of how serious the issue of the Northern Irish border is and take that into account. And it seems like people like Boris Johnson simply don't care so much about some of these political realities. And I also think saying Boris Johnson is a thoughtful politician, I just don't agree. I think he is someone who has consistently made Islamophobic, racist remarks about people in this country, and also has been part of a government that has not only not been able to deal with issues in the past 3 years. They have been in government since 2010. They have helped entrench inequality. They have overseen an immigration regime which has meant black Britons have been deported from this country and have had their rights to access to healthcare and to housing taken away from them.
Okay.
This is not a government that has done anything much positive at all for people in this country.
Jonathan?
And so I think we need to recognise that when we're talking about the past 9 years, not just the past 3.
Jonathan?
I mean, a whole load of slurs aimed at Boris Johnson there. Again, you forget the fact that Boris Johnson is the great-grandson of a Muslim, the fact that he has previously talked about having an amnesty for illegal immigrants, the fact that when he was at City Hall, he ran an incredibly diverse regime with representatives of all kinds of communities, as well as a pretty almost 50-50 gender balance as well, I think. I think Maya might be surprised by the Boris Johnson premiership. I think she might find him in effect in office to be far more of a liberal politician than perhaps she thinks.
Maya, when does the new Prime Minister go to Brussels?
I don't actually know when the new Prime Minister goes to Brussels. Oh, when should they? I mean, I think immediately. I think actually what needs to happen now is there needs to be real attempts to make conversations with people in Brussels and make sure that actually what Boris Johnson has done is he has essentially I think, signalled in the wrong way consistently to Brussels. What you are doing is you're engaging in negotiations. This isn't about who can, stare the other side out the longest. This is actually trying to find some kind of workable deal that can pass through Parliament, that will be good for the UK and that will also be good for the EU. And I think a lot of the discourse we have around Brexit, I don't think is that helpful. I think we need some kind of sensible discussion around this.
Jonathan, when should the next Prime Minister go to Brussels, do you think?
If I were advising him, I'd probably say his first trip should actually probably be over to Dublin to talk to the Irish Taoiseach and to remind people that he does care about the issues in respect of the Irish border, which are completely solvable, by the way, using existing technologies and practices. That is without question true. And in order also to commit...
Is it true? Because we've been told that that technology doesn't currently exist. Isn't that the problem?
Well, that's not true. If you look at,
isn't the problem though? At some point, that technology will exist in the future, and that's what all parties are working towards. But actually, we've been told by the European Union, senior officials within the European Union, that the technology doesn't currently exist.
No, that's not true. If you read the Prosperity UK Alternative Arrangements Commission report, which was published last week, co-chaired by Greg Hands and Nicky Morgan, who are both former cabinet ministers who both backed Remain, it made clear that the existing systems in place can be used. That you don't need to create new technology, because
what are those existing
increasingly across the world, customs declarations are being done electronically in advance of you don't have a man in a peaked cap at a border looking at every vehicle that goes across a border. That's simply not the case anymore.
So what is that technology, Jonathan?
Well, I say it exists. It's using online technology for making customs declarations, and both parties have said that if any checks do need to be done, they can be done away from a border. So there's absolutely no need for a hard border in Northern Ireland. My point here being that Boris Johnson, I think, needs to go to Dublin to reassure the Irish government that he's not going to put up a hard border, because they said they're not going to put one up either. I think that's important reassurance. But I also don't think that Boris Johnson should be going to Brussels as a supplicant, which is how far too often Theresa May was seen during the negotiations that she entered into over these last few years. Boris Johnson needs to, again, repeat some of the red lines about the UK position and to say that no deal is better than a bad deal, and mean it, which I'm afraid Theresa May didn't.
Okay, my final thought from you.
Yeah, I think that actually this talk of the Irish border needs to be taken much more seriously, and I don't think we've heard consistently that actually these kind of technological fixes aren't going to be possible. And so actually we need to be taking that, putting that at the forefront of our conversation about Brexit, actually. And I don't hold very high hopes for what Boris Johnson is going to do in government or with Brexit.
OK, my good fellow Jonathan Isaby, thank you both. Nice to get your